The question left her lips before she could stop it, raw and trembling in the dry desert air of that late October evening in 1882, standing in the amber glow of a kerosene lantern that swayed from the porch beam of the Doyle ranch house. Inez Aldridge looked up at the man who had over the past 2 weeks fed her, sheltered her, doctored her wounded ankle, and asked nothing in return, and the words tumbled out of her like water breaking through a cracked dam. "Why?" she whispered. "Why have you been so kind to me? I am a complete stranger to you. You owe me nothing. You knew nothing about me when you found me. Why would you do all of this?" Paul Doyle set down the tin cup he was holding. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples where the sweat of a long day's work had dried. His eyes were a shade of gray that shifted between slate and silver depending on the light, and right now, in the lantern glow, they were both. He looked at her for a long, slow moment, the kind of moment that seemed to stretch beyond the ordinary boundaries of time, and then the corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of something that had already been settled deep inside him before she had ever asked. "You are not a stranger anymore," he said. And those 5 words cracked something open in Inez Aldridge's chest that she had kept sealed shut for 3 years. 3 years of running, of hiding, of carrying a betrayal so heavy it had bent her spine and darkened her eyes, and made her forget what it felt like to be seen by another human being without suspicion or greed behind their gaze. She turned away quickly so he would not see the tears that came without permission. He did not reach for her. He simply stood there on the porch of his ranch in the New Mexico territory, in the warm autumn dark that smelled of dry grass and distant rain, and gave her the space to feel whatever needed to be felt. And that, more than anything, was what broke her completely and then, slowly, began to put her back together. But to understand why those words struck her so deeply, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a morning 3 weeks earlier, when Inez Aldridge rode into the territories on a stolen horse with an empty canteen, a bruised rib, and a secret that certain men would kill to keep buried. It was the first day of October, 1882, and the sky over the New Mexico territory was the kind of hard, bleached blue that offers no comfort. The land rolled out in every direction in shades of tan and rust, broken only by the occasional spike of a yucca plant or the skeletal reach of a dead cottonwood beside a dry creek bed. The road, if you could call it a road, was little more than 2 parallel ruts worn into the caliche by decades of wagon wheels and cattle drives. Inez had been riding since before dawn. Her name had been Inez Calloway once, before her marriage 3 years ago, and it had been Inez Barclay for the 2 years of that marriage, and it was Aldridge now, her mother's maiden name, because the woman she had been before Carson Barclay entered her life had vanished so completely that she'd had to reach back 2 generations to find a name that still felt like it belonged to her. She was 26 years old. She had dark hair she kept braided and pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, and her skin was the warm brown of her Mexican grandmother on her mother's side, a grandmother she had never met because her mother had been told to forget that side of herself when she married into an Anglo family in San Antonio. Inez had inherited that grandmother's cheekbones and her dark eyes, and as it turned out, her grandmother's iron stubbornness, which was the only reason she was still alive. The horse she rode was a sorrel gelding she had taken from a livery stable in Roswell 2 days prior. She had left enough money tucked under the stable door to cover the cost barely, because she was not a thief by nature, only by necessity. Her own horse had gone lame outside of Portals, and standing still was something Carson Barclay's men did not allow her to do. She did not know exactly how many men he had sent after her. She knew of at least 2, brothers named Fletcher and Gus Moreland, men who had served as Carson's enforcers for as long as she had known him. She had seen Fletcher in Roswell from a distance, moving through the market street with the unhurried patience of a man who is absolutely certain his quarry cannot escape. That certainty terrified her more than anything, more than the bruised rib, more than the exhaustion, more than the memory of what Carson had done when he finally understood that she had found the ledger. The ledger. That was the secret. A small, cloth-bound book filled with Carson Barclay's careful, meticulous handwriting, recording 3 years of bribes paid to county judges, land commissioners, and a United States Marshal named Everett Holt, all of it in service of a land-grabbing scheme that had stripped at least a dozen Mexican-American families of their properties in Chaves County through forged deeds and fraudulent tax assessments. Small ranches, family farms, land that had been held through Spanish land grants going back 100 years, stolen with a pen and a corrupt signature rather than a gun. Inez had discovered it by accident. She had been searching for her own marriage papers in Carson's study one evening while he was in town, looking for the document because she intended to visit a lawyer in Roswell about a quiet divorce, and instead she had found the ledger hidden beneath a false bottom in his desk drawer. She had read only 3 pages before she understood entirely what kind of man she had married and what kind of danger she was in. She had taken the ledger and left that same night. That had been 11 days ago. The sorrel horse stumbled on a loose stone, and Inez grabbed the saddle horn and steadied herself. The horse was tired. She was tired. Her water was gone, and her biscuits from the morning before had been the last of her food. She needed to find a town or a ranch or any human structure that could offer water and perhaps a few minutes of rest. She was scanning the horizon with the focused desperation of someone running out of options when she saw it. A thin line of green against the tan landscape to the southwest. The kind of green that meant water, and where there was water in this territory, there was usually a ranch. She turned the sorrel toward the green and urged him into a tired trot. What she found was the beginning of everything. The Doyle Ranch sat in a shallow valley carved out by a small tributary of the Pecos River, modest by the standards of the big cattle operations in the territory but prosperous enough, clearly the result of years of careful, determined work. There was a main house built of adobe and timber, solid and square, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. There were 2 barns, one larger and one smaller, and a series of corrals where horses moved in the late morning heat. A windmill turned slowly above a stock tank, and beside the house there was a kitchen garden that held the last of the season's tomatoes and squash going to seed. Inez rode up to the gate and stopped. She could feel the exhaustion in every muscle. She could feel the ledger pressed against her skin inside her blouse, where she had sewn it into a flat cloth pocket against her ribs, because it was the only truly safe place she had. She looked at the ranch house and tried to calculate the risk. Every human being was a potential threat now. Every stranger could be paid to report her location. But she was out of water and out of food, and her horse was nearly spent, and sometimes the calculus of survival overrides the calculus of caution. She rode through the gate. A dog came first, a big rough-coated blue heeler mix who barked twice and then, disconcertingly, wagged its tail. Then a ranch hand came out of the smaller barn, a young man of perhaps 20, dark-skinned and broad-faced, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her without hostility. "Help you, ma'am," he called. "I need water," Inez said. "For the horse and for myself I can pay." The young man nodded and pointed toward the stock tank. "Help yourself. Boss is up at the house if you want to talk to him." She watered the horse first, then filled her canteen and drank slowly, because drinking too fast after deprivation makes you sick, a lesson she had learned the hard way a week ago. She was still drinking when she heard boots on the porch steps, and she turned to find a man coming toward her across the yard. Paul Doyle was 32 years old in the autumn of 1882. And he had the kind of face that told you exactly what kind of life he had been living. Not in a worn-down way, but in a shaped way. The way good wood gets shaped by a craftsman into something that has both beauty and function. He was tanned from years of outdoor work, with lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting into the western sun. He was not the biggest man she had ever seen, but he moved with the settled confidence of someone who had earned his place in the world through honest labor and intended to keep it. He came to the edge of the stock tank and stopped, keeping a respectful distance. "You look like you have been riding hard," he said. There was no accusation in it. It was simply an observation. "I have been," Inez said. "Where are you headed?" "West," she said. "Las Cruces eventually." She watched him for any reaction to the vagueness of her answer. Some men would press. Some would get a narrow-eyed, speculative look. This man simply nodded as if west were a perfectly sufficient answer. "You will not make Las Cruces on that horse today," he said, looking at the sorrel with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his life with horses. "He has done about all he can do for the time being. You might push him another 5 miles before he goes down." Inez looked at her horse and knew he was right. She felt something close to despair pressing at the back of her throat. "If you want," Paul said, "you can rest him here. There is room in the corral and I have feed to spare. You can take the spare room at the house. My housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, is here, so there is nothing improper about it." Inez looked at him. She was looking for the hidden motive, the thing behind the kindness, because in her experience there was always something behind it. Men did not extend charity to lone women without expecting something in return. She had learned that lesson repeatedly, painfully, specifically. But his gray eyes held steady under her scrutiny, neither defensive nor calculating. They were simply, remarkably honest. "I cannot pay much," she said. "I did not ask for payment," he said. "She stayed one night." Then her ankle, which she had twisted jumping down from her horse to grab the ledger from her saddlebag when the sorrel spooked at a rattlesnake during her arrival, swelled up badly overnight. And Mrs. Finch, who was a stout and forthright woman in her 50s who had been Paul Doyle's late mother's closest friend, and had appointed herself a permanent fixture in the Doyle household, declared firmly that Inez was not going anywhere until she could walk without wincing. That one night became 3 days, and 3 days became a week. And by the end of the first week, something had shifted so quietly and so completely that Inez did not notice it until she was already inside it. She had begun to feel, against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed, almost safe. The ranch ran on a rhythm that was orderly and purposeful, the kind of daily pattern that speaks to a well-run operation and a man who takes care of the things in his charge. Paul was up before sunrise and worked until the light failed. He had 3 permanent hands: the young man Inez had first met, whose name was Marcus Webb, and 2 brothers named Teodoro and Alejandro Cisneros, both of them in their 30s, whose family had ranched in this territory before it was United States territory, when it was still part of Mexico. Paul treated them with the same matter-of-fact respect he showed everyone, giving orders without condescension and receiving suggestions without ego. And the operation of the ranch reflected the quality of those relationships in the condition of the animals and the tools and the land itself. Inez watched all of this from the porch during the first few days when her ankle kept her largely immobile, and what she watched made her deeply, almost painfully aware of how different this place was from every place she had been in the last 3 years. She and Paul ate dinner together in the evenings at the long oak table in the kitchen while Mrs. Finch sat in the adjoining sitting room with her sewing, close enough to serve as propriety but far enough away to allow the 2 of them to talk without being attended to, which felt very much like a deliberate arrangement and made Inez wonder exactly how well Mrs. Finch understood the situation. Paul talked without pretense. He told her about the ranch, how he had come to New Mexico territory from Missouri at the age of 23, after his father's death had left him with enough money to stake a land claim, but not enough to pretend he could afford to stay home. He talked about the first years, which had been brutal, a drought in 1876 and a cattle disease in 1877, and a hard winter in 1878 that had taken 30 head of cattle and 2 horses. He talked about the slow turn after that, the years when things began to go right, when the land responded to his care, and the cattle multiplied, and the corrals filled with good horses, and the kitchen garden produced enough to see them through 2 winters. He did not ask about her past, and she noticed the deliberate quality of that restraint. He did not ask where she came from, or why she was traveling alone, or what had happened to her ankle, or why she had the particular watchfulness of a woman who was expecting trouble to appear on the horizon at any moment. He asked her what she thought of the territory, whether she had been to New Mexico before, what she had observed from the porch about the horses in the corral, whether she had a preference between coffee and chicory in the evenings. He asked her, one night, about the books she had been reading from his modest shelf, and they talked for 2 hours about the novels she had read and the ones he had, and she discovered that they had both, independently, read and deeply loved Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and they had entirely opposite opinions about who was the true monster of the story, and the argument that followed was the most genuinely alive Inez had felt in 3 years. She laughed. Actually laughed, not the polite performance of laughter she had mastered during her marriage, but the real kind, sudden and unguarded, and leaving her slightly breathless. Paul watched her with an expression she did not know how to name. Not hunger, not calculation, something quieter and more serious than either. She stopped laughing and looked at the table. After a moment he said, very gently, "It is good to hear that." She did not answer, but she did not look away either. By the end of the first week, she was helping Mrs. Finch in the kitchen because her nature made it impossible to receive hospitality without contributing to it. She was competent in the kitchen, having grown up in a household where women were expected to be capable of everything practical, and Mrs. Finch accepted her assistance with the brisk efficiency of a woman who always has more work than hands, and they developed a functional partnership that within 2 days had evolved into something warmer, the particular warmth of 2 women who recognize in each other a fundamental practicality and find it deeply companionable. On the 8th day, a rider came. Inez was in the kitchen garden with Mrs. Finch when she heard the horse on the road, and something in the sound of it, a single horse moving at deliberate speed, not the casual pace of a neighbor or a peddler, but the purposeful pace of a man with a destination, made every hair on her arm stand up. She straightened and looked toward the road. The rider was a man she did not recognize, and that was both a relief and no relief at all, because the Moreland brothers operated through a network of paid informants and she could not know everyone in that network. The man rode a black horse and wore a dark coat and stopped at the gate, scanning the property with the slow thoroughness of someone who has been told what to look for. His eyes found her. She made herself not move. She made herself maintain the expression of a woman doing ordinary garden work, someone who belongs exactly where she is, nothing hidden, nothing feared. She was very good at masks. 3 years of marriage to Carson Barclay had made her excellent at wearing the right face for the moment. Paul came out of the barn. "Help you?" he called to the rider. The man at the gate said, "I am looking for a woman, dark hair, traveling alone, might have come through here in the last week or so. Name of Barclay." Paul looked at the man for a moment. Then he looked toward the garden, a brief, casual glance that took in Inez and Mrs. Finch and seemed to register nothing particular, and he looked back at the rider. "No woman by that name here," he said. It was technically true. Her name was Aldridge. She had told him that on the first day. "I'd have used a different name," the rider said. "A lot of people pass through," Paul said. "I have got 3 hands and a housekeeper and my own self here, nobody else." The rider looked at the garden again. Inez kept working, pulling dead tomato vines from their stakes with the measured movements of a woman who has nowhere to be. The rider seemed to weigh something. Then he touched the brim of his hat and turned his horse back down the road. When he was gone, Paul walked to the garden and stopped at the fence. He looked at Inez with those steady gray eyes, and she looked back at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally. He leaned against the fence post. "Do you want to tell me?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Not yet, maybe not ever. I do not want you involved in something that could bring trouble to your ranch or your people." He was quiet in turn. She watched him consider this, genuinely consider it rather than simply react to it, and she recognized the quality of that consideration as something rare in men, the willingness to actually think rather than simply impose. "All right," he said at last. "When you are ready." He went back to the barn. That evening at dinner she found she could not eat. The close call with the writer had stripped away the temporary comfort of the past week and replaced it with the raw awareness of how exposed she still was. The ledger under her blouse felt heavier than its actual weight. She kept thinking about Fletcher Moreland in Roswell, moving through the market with his unhurried certainty, and about Carson Barclay in his fine house in Chaves County, making his careful calculations. She pushed her food around her plate. "Eat," Paul said quietly. She looked up. "Whatever is coming," he said, "you will face it better with food in you." It was such a simple, practical thing to say, entirely without drama, and yet it settled something in her chest. She picked up her fork and ate. Afterward, sitting on the porch with the warm night air full of cricket sound and the distant lowing of cattle, the dark sky overhead blazing with the extraordinary density of stars that you can only see in places far from artificial light, she made a decision. She told him. Not everything, not at first. She told him about Carson, about the marriage, about the discovering of the ledger and the families whose land had been stolen. She told him about the night she had left, and the 2 weeks of riding and hiding, and the Moreland brothers. She told him about the ledger itself, pressed against her ribs inside its cloth pocket, and the plan she had vaguely formed to get it to someone in Las Cruces or Santa Fe who had both the authority and the integrity to use it, which she admitted was a plan built mostly on hope rather than certainty, since she was not at all sure such a person existed. Paul listened to all of it without interrupting. He sat with his forearms resting on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, and when she was done he was quiet for a while. "The marshal you mentioned," he said, "Everett Holt." "Yes, he is the territorial marshal for this district." "I know." "Which means anyone you might try to bring this to locally would be in his jurisdiction and potentially in his pocket." "I know that too," he nodded slowly. "There is a federal circuit judge," he said. "Judge Raymond Aldis. He rides the circuit from Santa Fe. He is not a man who can be bought, from everything I have heard, and I have heard enough about him over the years to believe it. He has a reputation for going after corruption specifically, has overturned 2 county land commissioner decisions that I know of." Inez stared at him. "How do you know about him?" "Because Teodoro Cisneros' family lost 40 acres to a fraudulent tax assessment in 1879, Paul said, and there was a quiet, controlled anger under his voice that had not been there before. "They fought it. I helped them fight it. We lost, but I have been paying attention to the legal landscape in this territory ever since because I want to know when the right tool becomes available." Inez felt something shift in her understanding of this man, another layer revealing itself beneath the one she had already seen. She had thought him kind. She had not yet fully understood that he was also principled, and that those 2 qualities in him were not separate things but the same thing expressed in different circumstances. "Judge Aldis will be in Las Cruces in November," Paul said. "He holds court there for 2 weeks every fall. That gives us approximately a month." "Us," Inez said. He met her eyes. "Us," he said again, without hesitation or qualification. She did not know what to do with that. She looked out at the dark desert and the blazing stars, and thought about the word us, and what it meant to hear it from someone who was not obligated to her by blood or contract or debt. Someone who simply chose it. "This is not your fight," she said. "It became my fight when Teodoro's family lost their land," he said. "Your evidence makes it possible to finish what I started 3 years ago. That makes it very much my fight." There was nothing she could say to that. So she said nothing, and they sat together in the warm dark for another hour, and the night around them was very quiet and very full. The next days carried a changed quality. A subtle but unmistakable tension that was not unpleasant. The tension of 2 people who have shared a significant truth and are now navigating the altered landscape that truth has created. Paul began briefing her in the evenings on the territory, on who could be trusted and who could not, on the roads west and the water sources and the small towns where strangers were noticed and remembered. He was methodical about it, drawing crude but accurate maps on the backs of paper and explaining the logic behind each route. In return, without quite deciding to, Inez began to talk more freely. She told him about San Antonio, about her childhood in a household that was perpetually caught between two cultures and never quite at ease in either. She told him about her mother and the grandmother she had never met, the one she had taken her name from, and about the particular loneliness of growing up between worlds, belonging fully to neither. She told him, one afternoon when they were both working on the fence line near the south pasture, he driving posts and she handing him the rails, about the night she had understood that her marriage to Carson Barclay was a trap she had walked into with her eyes open because she had been so desperate to belong somewhere that she had mistaken his possession of her for his care of her. Paul set down his post driver and looked at her. "You were not foolish," he said. "I was not careful," she said. "They are not the same thing. He was deliberately deceptive. That is on him, not on you." She handed him another rail. "You are very decided about that." "Because it is true," he said simply, and went back to driving the post. She stood there with the next rail in her hands and thought about being told a true thing without ceremony or qualification, just because it was true, and about how rarely in her life that had happened. 3 days later, trouble arrived in a form more immediate than a single rider. It was a Tuesday morning, the 17th of October, and Inez was in the smaller barn helping Marcus groom the horses, a task she had taken on because horses calmed her, and because physical work was the only thing that kept the anxious part of her mind quiet. She heard the dogs first, a sustained, alarmed barking that was different from the announcement bark she had learned to recognize, and she went to the barn door and looked out. 2 horses were coming through the gate at a canter, and on them were 2 men she recognized immediately and felt the recognition in her stomach like a dropped stone. Fletcher Moreland was the older one, perhaps 35, with a yellow mustache and pale eyes that she had always found deeply unpleasant in the specific way of eyes that look at everything as a commodity. His brother Gus was younger, thicker through the body, and wore the expression of a man who is paid primarily to be large and obedient. They pulled up in the yard. Paul came out of the house. He had apparently been inside doing accounts, because he had no hat on and there were ink stains on his right hand. Inez pressed herself back into the shadow of the barn door and watched. "Morning," Fletcher Moreland said. "We are looking for a woman." Dark hair about 5.5 feet answers to Inez. She is a fugitive from Chaves County wanted for theft. "Theft," Paul said. His voice was entirely neutral. "Stole from her husband," Fletcher said. "Important documents. She is dangerous." "How dangerous is a woman with stolen documents?" Paul said. Fletcher's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "Her husband is an important man in Chaves County. He just wants his property back and his wife back safely. We are here to help ensure that." "I see," Paul said. "And do you have papers, a warrant of some kind?" "The marshal has issued a directive." "That is not a warrant." "And Marshal Holt's authority does not extend to private property without a warrant issued by a judge." Paul's voice was still perfectly calm, perfectly conversational. "You are welcome to water your horses at the stock tank. I have not seen any woman matching that description. Now I have work to get back to." Fletcher looked at the barn. For one terrible second Inez felt certain he was going to ride toward it, and she tensed to move deeper into the shadows. But Paul stepped slightly to the right, a casual movement, positioning himself between the barn and the riders, and Fletcher's gaze came back to him. "You are sure?" Fletcher said. "I am," Paul said. After another long moment, Fletcher touched his hat brim. "We will be checking the area." "You are welcome to ride the roads," Paul said. "Stay off my property." They watered their horses and left. Inez came out of the barn. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to still them. Paul had gone back to the porch and was sitting in the chair there with a stillness that she now recognized as his particular form of controlled anger. "Those were the Moreland brothers," she said. "I figured. They will be back." "Yes," he said. "They will be back with a warrant, which means they have gone to a judge, which means we need to move faster than I planned." He looked up at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen there before, something tight and urgent. But underneath it was that same steadiness, that same quality of a man who has decided what he believes and will not be moved from it by external pressure. "I am going to send word to Judge Aldous tonight," he said. "Alejandro can ride to Santa Fe. The judge should know what is in that ledger before the Morelands get legal cover to come back here." "Alejandro will be putting himself at risk," Inez said. "I will ask him. He will want to know what the evidence involves." He paused, regarding his family's case. That evening Paul spoke to Alejandro Cisneros, and Inez watched from a distance as the man's expression moved through several things when Paul explained what the ledger contained: disbelief, then recognition, then a particular hard-edged fury that she understood in her bones, because it was the anger of someone who has been wronged by a system designed to make the wrong irreversible. Then Alejandro nodded once, with a decisiveness that was almost formal, and went to saddle a horse. He was gone by dark. The ranch felt smaller without him. Marcus moved more quietly around the barns, and Teodoro spent more time near the main gate with the kind of watchful stillness that said he was ready. Paul worked through the days with methodical focus, but she caught him sometimes at the perimeter of whatever task he was engaged in, looking south down the road, and she understood that the waiting was the hardest part for him. For her, the waiting was not hard in the way she expected. She had thought it would be pure anxiety, pure dread, the same exhausting hypervigilance of the past weeks, and some of that was there. But it was layered over with something else, something she could not immediately name, and then, in the quiet of one of those evenings on the porch, she named it. She was not waiting alone. She had been waiting alone for 3 years, even inside her marriage, perhaps most acutely inside her marriage. She had been alone through the discovery and the leaving and the 2 weeks of running. And now she was not, and the difference was so enormous and so simple that she felt almost embarrassed by how much it meant to her. On the evening of the second day after Alejandro's departure, Paul came and sat beside her on the porch after dinner, and instead of talking about the practicalities of their situation, which had been the substance of most of their conversations in the past few days, he said, "Tell me what you would do if this were already over. If you had given the ledger to Judge Aldous and Barclay and Holt were dealt with and you were free to go anywhere." She looked at him. The question felt like a gift, like someone giving her permission to imagine a future, which was something she had not allowed herself in a very long time. "I think I would go north," she said slowly. "I always wanted to see Colorado. I have heard the mountains there are something entirely different from what I have seen. Something that makes you feel how large the world is rather than how small you are." "They do that," he said. She looked at him. "You have been." "Once. A long time ago when I was traveling from Missouri. I went north through Denver before I came south to the territory." He was quiet for a moment. "It makes you feel both very small and very significant at the same time. I do not know how to explain it better than that." She understood exactly what he meant, which surprised her because she had never been to Colorado, and she said so. He smiled. It was not the partial, reserved expression she had become accustomed to seeing, but a full smile that reached his eyes and changed his face entirely. And Inez felt something warm and complicated move through her that she decided immediately she was not ready to examine. "What about you?" she said. "What would you do if you could go anywhere?" He considered this seriously. "I would stay here," he said. "I have built something here that I believe in, but I think I would like the thing I have built here to be fuller than it currently is. A ranch is not quite a home until there is more than one person in it who belongs there." He said it without particular emphasis, looking out at the dark yard, and Inez did not look at him because she was aware that her face might betray something she was not yet prepared to admit. "That is a reasonable thing to want," she said carefully. "I think so," he said. They sat in the dark for a long time, and the night was full of crickets and wind and the distant conversation of coyotes, and neither of them said anything more about Colorado or belonging. But the words hung between them with a weight and a warmth that Inez carried with her to bed and lay with in the dark for a long time before she slept. Alejandro came back on the 5th day with a letter. Judge Raymond Aldis, it turned out, had been gathering evidence against Everett Holt for 18 months and needed only a single corroborating witness with documentary proof to make a case that could not be dismissed. He wanted the ledger. He wanted Inez's testimony. He would be in Las Cruces on the 1st of November and would send federal deputies to escort them if Paul could get Inez to the town of Estancia by the 28th of October, where an escort would meet them. Alejandro handed Paul the letter and then handed him a second, smaller, sealed envelope. "For the woman," he said. The judge wrote it himself. Inez opened the second letter alone in the spare room, sitting on the edge of the bed with the evening light coming through the small window. Judge Aldis wrote in the clipped, direct style of a man accustomed to legal language, but capable of setting it aside when the occasion called for it. He told her that her courage in taking the ledger and maintaining possession of it under pressure was the act of someone with both principle and strength. He told her that the families whose land had been stolen would have the best possible chance of restitution if she testified, and that he would personally ensure her safety during and after the proceedings. He told her that Marshal Holt had already been placed under federal investigation and that his authority in the territory was effectively suspended, which meant the warrant the Morelands were seeking would be unenforceable. She read the letter 3 times. Then she sat very still for a while with her hands flat on her knees. She went to find Paul. He was at the corral fence watching the horses in the last of the evening light, and she came and stood beside him and gave him the letter to read. He read it in silence, and when he was done he folded it carefully and handed it back. "That is good news," he said. "It is," she said. She hesitated. "I owe you something that I am not sure I can adequately express." He shook his head. "You do not owe me anything." "Paul," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without the slight formality that had been there before, and they both registered it. "You hid me from men who would have dragged me back to a man who would have destroyed the evidence of crimes against more than a dozen families. You sent your ranch hand on a 5-day ride to Santa Fe at your own risk. You have fed me and sheltered me, and treated me with more genuine respect than most people have managed in my entire adult life. I owe you more than I can say." He turned to look at her. His gray eyes were very serious. "Then do not say it," he said. "Just remember that it exists. Remember that someone chose to act this way, so that you will recognize it again if it happens." She looked at him and understood that he was not simply being modest. He was telling her something about herself, about the fact that she deserved to be treated this way and should expect it, should require it, rather than experience it as a miracle. It was one of the most precise and generous things anyone had ever said to her, and she felt it land somewhere very deep. "I will remember," she said softly. He nodded once and looked back at the horses. She stood beside him in the gathering dark, close enough to feel the warmth he gave off in the cool October evening, and the question that had been forming in her chest for days pressed up against the inside of her ribs like a living thing. "Paul," she said, why have you done all of this? Not just the hiding and the letter to the judge, all of it, from the very first day, from the water at the stock tank. You have treated me with such genuine care, and I am a stranger." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down the cup he was holding and turned to face her with full attention, and in the light of the lantern on the porch, his eyes were that shifting silver gray. And he said, "You are not a stranger anymore." She heard it and felt the warmth and the crack of it simultaneously, the warmth of being claimed by kindness, the crack of the wall she had built so carefully around herself beginning to give. "When did that happen?" she asked, and her voice was very quiet, He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to every question. "Somewhere around the first evening," he said. "When you told Mrs. Finch her biscuits were the best you had ever tasted, and then when she went to the other room you told me in all honesty that they were a bit heavy but you would never in 1,000 years tell her so." He paused. "That was a very human thing to do. I thought, this is a person I would like to know." Inez laughed, the real laugh, the unguarded one, and this time she did not look away afterward. She looked directly at him, and what she saw in his face was something she recognized because it was reflected in her own chest, a feeling that had been building for 2 weeks under the surface of every practical conversation, every shared evening, every moment of his steady, unbending decency. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the fence rail. He turned his hand over under hers and held it. They stood like that for a long time, looking out at the horses in the corral and the last light leaving the western sky, and neither of them said anything else, and nothing needed to be said. The journey to Estancia took 3 days. Paul had insisted on coming with her, and this time she had not argued, partly because the threat of the moorlands was still real enough until Holt's suspension was officially confirmed, and partly because she did not want to argue. They rode out before sunrise on the 25th of October with 2 horses and enough supplies for the journey and Alejandro following a day behind on a separate route as a precaution, carrying a sealed copy of the ledger's most critical pages that Inez had spent 2 evenings carefully transcribing. The first day of riding was through the familiar landscape near the ranch, the dry valleys and the low mesas, and the occasional stand of piñon pines, and they talked throughout the day with the easy, ranging quality of 2 people who have moved past the careful stage and into the open country of genuine knowing. She told him about books she had read and languages she had attempted to learn and opinions she had about everything from cattle breeding to the territorial government, to the proper way to make tamales, which was an opinion delivered with considerable passion and some humor about the inadequacy of most Anglo attempts at the food. He listened and responded and pushed back when he disagreed and agreed when he agreed, and the day passed in a way that felt nothing like covering ground and everything like arriving somewhere. The second night they camped in the shelter of a rock formation that offered both shade and a clear view of the approaches, a military instinct Paul had developed from hard experience. They built a small fire and ate dried beef, and the last of Mrs. Finch's exceptionally heavy but not entirely unappreciated biscuits, and sat on either side of the fire in the cold that had come in with the night, which was sharp and clean and smelled of pine from the higher elevations to the north. "Can I ask you something?" Inez said. "You can always ask me something," he said. "Have you been alone since you came to the territory? I mean, not just without a wife. I mean alone in the way that you have been carrying things by yourself. The ranch, the situation with the Cisneros family, all of it." He was quiet. "More or less," he said at last. "My mother was alive until 1879. She came out from Missouri after my father died and lived at the ranch for 2 years. And she and Mrs. Finch were the reason the ranch became something livable rather than just functional. After she died, it went back to mostly functional." He paused. "I did not realize until fairly recently how much of a difference that makes, the distinction between a place that operates and a place that lives." "What made you realize it?" she said. He looked across the fire at her. The firelight was warm on his face. "Recent events," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her coffee cup and decided to be honest because she had discovered over the past 2 weeks that honesty in his company was something that came more easily than it had ever come anywhere else. "I am frightened," she said. "Of the moorlands. Of this," she said. "Of whatever this is. I made a terrible choice once by confusing being wanted with being loved, and I paid for that choice for 2 years, and I am not sure I trust my own judgment." He was quiet for a long moment. "That is a reasonable thing to be frightened of," he said. "I am not going to tell you not to be. But I will tell you this. Whatever I feel, and I think it is fairly evident that I feel something, it does not carry any urgency beyond what is natural. You have time to be certain. That is not a commodity I am withholding. It is one I am offering." She looked at him across the fire. "You are a very unusual man," she said. "I have been called worse," he said, and the smile came again, the full one, and she felt it in the center of her chest like the first warmth of the morning sun. On the third day they rode into Estancia and found the federal deputies waiting. Two men who presented badges and paperwork and spoke with the clipped formality of men carrying official weight. And the shift from the private territory of the past 3 days to the public world of official process was abrupt and disorienting. But Paul was beside her through the meeting with the deputies, and through the verification of documents, and through the careful planning of the final leg to Las Cruces. He spoke on her behalf when she needed it and stepped back when she did not. And she realized with a clear-eyed certainty that had nothing to do with fear or desperation, that this was the quality she had been looking for her entire adult life in another human being. The quality of someone who stands beside you rather than in front of you or behind you. They reached Las Cruces on the 31st of October, with federal deputies on either side and Alejandro riding a respectful distance behind, his copy of the transcription safe in his saddle bag. The town was a grid of adobe buildings and cottonwood trees along the Rio Grande, with the Organ Mountains rising to the east in sharp purple relief against the blue autumn sky. It was a larger town than anywhere Inez had been in weeks, and the noise and density of it after the desert quiet felt both familiar and strange. Judge Raymond Aldis was a compact, white-haired man with a full beard and eyes that were brilliant blue and missed absolutely nothing. He received them in the parlor of the hotel he used when riding circuit, a formal room with a table and chairs, and he stood when Inez entered and shook her hand as though she were any other person coming to conduct important business, which she later thought was probably the most dignified thing anyone had done for her in a professional context. She gave him the ledger. He opened it, looked at several pages, and then looked up at her with those sharp blue eyes. "You have carried this for 3 weeks," he said. "Against my ribs, mostly," she said. His expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile but contained a great deal of respect. "Then it has been well kept," he said. "I intend to make very good use of it." The hearing took 4 days. Inez testified on the second and third days, sitting in a formal courtroom that had been established in the town's largest building, speaking clearly and completely about everything she had witnessed and everything the ledger contained. Paul was in the gallery every session, a steady presence in the back left corner, and she did not look at him while she testified because she needed to keep her full attention on the process, and because she knew that if she looked at him, she would feel the emotion that was running close to the surface, and she needed to be precise and credible rather than moved. But she knew he was there, and that knowledge organized something in her spine and helped her sit straight. Marshal Everett Holt had been brought to Las Cruces under federal escort and sat at a separate table with a lawyer, and he had the look of a man watching his careful constructed world dismantle itself piece by piece, and knowing there was nothing left to do but watch. Carson Barclay was not present, which the judge explained was because he had fled to Texas when the federal investigation became public, and his legal situation was now in the hands of the Texas authorities, which meant it was complicated but not hopeless. The Moreland brothers were nowhere in sight. Inez suspected they had read the situation correctly and chosen discretion. On the 4th day, Judge Aldis delivered his findings. Everett Holt was suspended from office immediately and remanded to federal custody pending a criminal trial. The fraudulent deeds and tax assessments recorded in the ledger were formally voided. He ordered an investigation into each of the affected land cases and appointed a special commissioner to oversee the review process and determine restitution. He looked at Inez when he delivered the final portion of his ruling, and she heard in his words the understanding that this was not simply a legal proceeding, but the partial correction of a series of injustices that should never have occurred, and that the correction was imperfect and incomplete but real. She sat very still when it was over, and the room was loud around her, and after a moment she felt a hand rest briefly on her shoulder and knew, without looking, that it was Paul, and she put her own hand over his and held it there for a moment. Teodoro Cisneros was in the gallery too, and when Inez turned she saw him standing with his hands clasped and his eyes bright, and she knew what this meant for him and his brother and the memory of their family's loss, and she thought about the grandmother she had never met, the woman whose name she carried, and she thought that perhaps names carry more than identity, perhaps they carry intention, and perhaps she had been fulfilling something without knowing it. That evening Paul found her sitting alone by the Rio Grande, watching the water move in the last light, the cottonwoods along the bank dropping their last leaves into the current. He sat down beside her. "It is over," she said. "The legal part," he said. "Yes." She looked at the river. "I do not know what I do next," she said. "I have been so focused on the destination that I have not thought carefully about what the destination actually means." "What do you want it to mean?" he said. She was quiet for a long time. The river moved and the cottonwood leaves turned in the current, gold and brown, catching the last of the light. "I want to stop running," she said. "I have been running toward something my whole life, one place to another, one attempt at belonging to another. I want to stop running and be somewhere that is mine." "Or yours and someone else's," he said quietly. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the river, but she could see his profile and the careful, measured way he was holding himself, the particular stillness of a man who has said something significant and is now waiting. "Paul," she said. He turned. She said, "I need to tell you something that I have been thinking about for 2 weeks and perhaps should have said sooner." "Tell me," he said. "I think I am in love with you," she said. "I know that is fast. I know it has only been 3 weeks, and the circumstances have been extreme. And I cannot promise you that it is not partly gratitude or relief, or the particular distortion that crisis creates in human feeling. But I have been very honest with myself about this, and I believe it is real. And I believe you feel the same way, and I believe we are both being very careful and sensible about it, which I respect, but I want you to know what I feel." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I fell in love with you on the second night when you told me your theory about Frankenstein and argued it for 2 hours with more passion and precision than any legal advocate I have ever heard, and I thought, whatever happens, I do not want to go back to evenings without that in them." She made a small sound that was partly a laugh and partly something else entirely. "It is not fast," he said. "We have known each other more truly in 3 weeks than most people manage in 3 years. Circumstance will do that. I believe in what I know." She leaned toward him and he moved toward her, and they met somewhere in the middle, the way that people who recognize each other always do, inevitably and without surprise, and the first kiss was brief and warm and entirely sufficient as a statement of everything that had been building between them. When they drew back she was smiling, and so was he, and the Rio Grande kept moving past them in the last of the October light. They stayed in Las Cruces through the first week of November, while the legal proceedings were completed and the formal documentation processed. Inez gave one more statement to a federal recorder and signed 3 sets of official papers, and was given a formal letter from Judge Aldous confirming that she was a cooperating witness with full legal protection, and that no charges of any kind had been or could be brought against her in connection with the matters in question. She folded that letter and put it in her bag, and felt the last of the running go out of her like water draining from a pan. On the 8th of November, they began the ride back east toward the Doyle ranch, and it was a different journey entirely from the one they had made coming in. The urgency was gone, and the threat was gone, and what remained was the open land and the autumn sky, and the two of them moving through it with the particular ease of people who have already decided the important things, and are simply waiting for the ordinary time to arrange itself around those decisions. Paul talked during that ride about the ranch in a different way than he had before, not describing it as an entity he managed, but as a place he inhabited, the difference between a report and a home. He talked about the changes he had been thinking about for years, but had not made because there had been no one to make them with or for. A bigger kitchen garden, a covered walkway between the house and the smaller barn, a proper library wall in the front room for the books that currently lived in stacks and piles and precarious towers throughout the house. Inez listened and asked questions and offered opinions that he received with attention, and the conversation of those 3 days on the road was the most useful conversation she had ever had, the kind that builds something rather than simply passing time. On the second night, camped again under the wide desert sky with the fire between them and the coyote speaking in the distance, she said, "I want to stay." He looked across the fire at her. "At the ranch," she said. "I want to stay, not because I have nowhere else to go. I want to be clear that I am not staying out of necessity. I have choices now, the legal business is settled, and I have my freedom and I could go anywhere. I am telling you that out of all the places I could go, I want to go to your ranch. I want to be there." She paused. "With you, properly, if you mean what I think you mean." He held her gaze across the fire with those steady gray eyes. "I mean to marry you," he said. "If you will have me, when you are ready. There is no urgency beyond wanting to be clear that that is my intention." "It is mine too," she said. "I want to be clear back." He smiled. "Then we are clear," he said. "Exceptionally," she said, and they were both quiet after that, but it was the warm, settled quiet of two people who have come to an agreement about something fundamental and are resting in the rightness of it. They arrived back at the Doyle ranch on the 11th of November to find Mrs. Finch on the porch with her arms crossed and an expression on her face that managed to be both severe and profoundly satisfied, as though she had known from the beginning how this would end and was mildly irritated that it had taken everyone else so long to catch up. "Well," she said, looking at them as they dismounted. "About time." "Mrs. Finch," Paul said. "I am starting an extra pot of coffee," she said, and went inside. Inez looked at Paul. "She knew," Inez said. "She has known everything that has ever happened in this house approximately 12 minutes before it happened," Paul said. "It is one of her most remarkable qualities." Inez laughed and took her horse to the corral, and the ranch settled around her with the particular quality that places have when they recognize you as theirs. The engagement was announced over dinner that evening, though announced is perhaps too formal a word for the way it happened, which was Paul saying to the assembled table of Marcus and Teodoro and Alejandro and Mrs. Finch, "Inez has agreed to marry me," with a plainness that made it both simple and enormous, and the response was immediate and warm, Marcus raising his coffee cup and Teodoro nodding with a smile of deep satisfaction and Alejandro saying quietly in Spanish something that Inez understood, and that made her eyes fill unexpectedly with warmth. Mrs. Finch said, "I will make biscuits tomorrow." "They are wonderful biscuits," Paul said, without looking at Inez. Inez, very carefully, did not look at him either, and the effort of maintaining a straight face was one of the most enjoyable efforts she had ever made. They were married in January of 1883, 6 weeks after the return to the ranch. The ceremony was held in the small adobe church in the nearest town, 12 miles east, on a Thursday that was cold and clear with a sky so blue it seemed painted. Inez wore a dress of deep green wool that Mrs. Finch had made with formidable efficiency over the preceding weeks, and Paul wore his good dark coat that he had last worn to his mother's funeral, and which he had taken out and brushed and declared fit for the occasion. They were married by a Methodist minister who asked them both the standard questions and seemed satisfied with the degree of sincerity he received in the answers. Teodoro and Alejandro stood up for Paul, and Mrs. Finch stood up for Inez, and Marcus Webb sat in the front pew and wept without any apparent embarrassment, which Inez found extremely endearing and would tease him about warmly for years afterward. Judge Aldis had sent a letter of congratulations when informed of the coming marriage, which was a surprisingly warm letter from a man she had known primarily in a formal legal context, and which she kept in the small cedar box where she put the things she intended to keep. After the ceremony, they drove back to the ranch in the wagon, with the winter light slanting gold across the desert floor, and the Organ Mountains far to the west, catching the last of the afternoon sun on their peaks. And Inez sat beside Paul with his arm around her shoulders, and thought that the feeling she had right now was the feeling she had been looking for since she was old enough to know she was looking for something, and that it felt exactly like arriving. The first year of their marriage was full. Full in the way that a well-lived year is full, not of drama or crisis, but of the daily accumulation of things that matter. The ranch continued to grow and to prosper, and Inez was not an idle presence in that growth, but a genuine partner to it, bringing to the enterprise both practical skills and a determined intelligence that complemented Paul's careful, methodical approach with something quicker and more improvisational. They argued sometimes, not in the way of people who damage each other, but in the way of people who think differently about things and are both committed enough to work it out. And those arguments almost always ended in better decisions than either of them would have reached alone. In the spring of 1883, Judge Aldous sent word that the first 3 cases of land restitution from the Barclay Ledger had been resolved. Families were being restored to properties they had lost. The Cisneros family would recover 20 of their 40 acres, which was not everything but was more than they had ever expected. And the day Teodoro and Alejandro received that news, Inez and Paul sat with them on the porch of the ranch house and drank coffee and said very little, because there was nothing to say that would improve on what the silence held. Carson Barclay was tried in Texas in June of 1883 and convicted of fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 7 years. It was a sentence Inez received with a specific, clear-eyed feeling that was not triumph, and not relief exactly, but something more like the closing of a chapter, the sense of a story arriving at its correct conclusion. She told Paul about it that evening, and he listened, and then asked how she felt, and she told him honestly, which was that she felt free in a way she had not quite managed to feel yet, even through all the other endings of the past months, because this particular ending meant that the man who had tried to erase her could not reach her anymore. "You were never erased," Paul said. "You should know that." "I know it better now than I did," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat with the spring evening coming in through the open window, and the ranch settling into its nighttime sounds. And she thought about the grandmother she had never met, whose name she carried, and thought that she hoped wherever that woman was, she knew that the name had found a good place to land. Their first child was born in February of 1884, a boy they named Samuel James Doyle, after Paul's father and Inez's maternal grandfather respectively, a name that honored both sides of the story they had come from. Samuel was born at the ranch with Mrs. Finch in attendance, and a doctor who had ridden 12 miles in cold weather to be present, and who declared afterward that he had rarely attended such an organized delivery, by which he meant that Inez had been extremely specific about what she needed, and Paul had provided all of it without being asked twice. Paul held his son for the first time with an expression Inez had never seen on his face before, a complete, unguarded openness, and she watched him from the bed where she lay recovering and felt something settle in her chest that was beyond happiness, something more permanent than that. "Hello, Samuel," Paul said, very quietly, in the particular voice that people use with newborns, lower and gentler than their ordinary voice, as though the world is louder than what is needed right now. Samuel James Doyle had his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn mouth, and he was, from the first hours, absolutely himself. Mrs. Finch took one look at him, announced that he was perfect and would be troublesome, and went to make biscuits, because she expressed every significant emotion through biscuits and always had. The years that followed were good years. Not easy years in the way of years without difficulty or loss, because life on a ranch in the New Mexico territory in the 1880s was always capable of presenting difficulty. There were dry summers and hard winters, and the ordinary accumulating challenges of raising cattle and horses on land that did not give anything away for free. Paul's left shoulder was broken in the summer of 1884 when a horse threw him against a corral fence, and the mending of it was slow and frustrating, and tested his patience in ways that nothing else quite had. And Inez managed that period with a combination of firm practicality and private tenderness that she delivered quietly and without ceremony. There were larger difficulties, too. The land issues in the territory continued long after the Barclay case was resolved, because the structural conditions that had allowed Barclay and Holt to operate did not disappear with the removal of those two men. Inez became, somewhat to her own surprise, a local figure in the ongoing effort to document and contest fraudulent land claims, corresponding with Judge Aldis and with several advocacy organizations that were beginning to organize in Santa Fe, and occasionally making the long journey to testify or consult, or simply to be a persistent and well-informed presence in rooms where decisions were made. Paul supported this work without reservation, adjusting the management of the ranch around her absences with the same matter-of-fact competence he applied to everything. Marcus Webb, who had been with Paul since the ranch's early years, married a woman named Rosa Delgado in 1885, and their wedding at the ranch was the occasion of one of the finest celebrations the property had ever seen, with food from Rosa's considerable family and music that lasted until the stars were all the way up in the sky, and the children, of whom there were several belonging to Teodoro's family, had fallen asleep in various locations around the yard. In the spring of 1886, Inez discovered she was expecting again. She told Paul on a Tuesday morning in April, standing in the kitchen garden in the early light while the mockingbirds were arguing in the mesquite trees, and his face did that thing again, that complete, unguarded openness that she had only seen a handful of times, and that remained one of the most valuable sights she had ever been given access to. "Another one," he said, in a tone of deep satisfaction. "Another one," she confirmed. He crossed the garden and held her, and she put her arms around him and felt the morning sun on her back and the familiar, beloved substance of him under her hands. And she thought that this, exactly this, was what she would describe if someone asked her to describe the word home. Their second child was a girl, born in November of 1886, and they named her Clara Rose Doyle. Clara for Paul's mother and Rose because when they had asked Samuel what name he thought the baby should have, he had said Rose with absolute authority, and they had decided to incorporate it, because a 2-year-old's decisive certainty deserved some recognition. Clara Rose was born with her mother's dark eyes and her own entirely individual personality, which announced itself within the first week as determined, curious, and possessed of opinions about everything. Samuel, at 2.5, regarded his sister with the careful attention of a small person encountering something entirely new, and then decided she was interesting and therefore acceptable, and began explaining the world to her in lengthy, earnest monologues that she listened to with an attentiveness that she would eventually use to learn to walk, talk, and argue, usually by following her brother's example and then improving on it. In 1887, Alejandro Cisneros met a woman named Esperanza at a church gathering in a nearby town and was married by summer's end. The wedding was a large celebration that mixed Anglo and Mexican customs in a way that was both joyful and, in his thought, quietly meaningful, a small embodiment of what the territory could be when its different inhabitants chose to honor rather than erase each other. Teodoro, older and quieter than his brother, remained the steady center of the ranch operation through all the changes of those years, and in 1888 he was made a full partner in the ranch rather than a hired hand, an arrangement Paul proposed, and Inez endorsed without hesitation, as the correct recognition of a man whose investment in the place was indistinguishable in quality from their own. Paul and Inez's third child, another boy they named Augusto Aldridge Doyle, carrying both the territory and the maternal side of the family in his name, came in 1889, born in the same spare room where Inez had first recovered from her twisted ankle in the autumn of 1882, which Mrs. Finch pointed out was a rather satisfying symmetry, and which Paul agreed was exactly that. Augusto was a quieter child than either of his siblings, watchful in the way his mother was watchful, though in him it expressed itself as deep curiosity rather than self-protection. And from the time he could walk, he followed Paul or Teodoro around the ranch with a focused attention that made the older men describe him privately as the next foreman, which made Inez laugh. Mrs. Finch, who was now approaching 70, and had been a permanent fixture in the household for so long that it was impossible to imagine the ranch without her, developed a particular relationship with the children that was entirely her own, partly stern and partly devoted, dispensing practical wisdom and heavy biscuits in equal measure. She had a rocking chair on the porch that was universally understood to be hers, and on summer evenings when the work was done and the light was long, she would sit in it and hold whichever grandchild-adjacent small person wanted holding, and tell them stories about the Missouri she had come from, and the territory she had chosen, and all the things she had seen in between. Inez sat on the porch those evenings sometimes, watching, and felt the layers of it, the choices and the accidents and the kindnesses that had built this particular life into this particular shape, and she was grateful for all of them, even the hard ones, even the 3 years of a bad marriage and the running and the fear, because those things had put her on the road with an empty canteen and a bruised rib on a particular October morning in 1882, riding toward a thin line of green on the horizon. One evening in the early summer of 1890, 8 years after the day, she had ridden through the gate of the Doyle ranch for the first time. Inez was sitting on the porch in the long light, watching Paul work with Samuel in the near corral, teaching the 6-year-old how to properly halter a horse, and the patience and care with which he was doing it made something move through her that she recognized as a feeling she had felt many times but never quite got used to. She heard the screen door and Mrs. Finch came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in her rocking chair and handed one over without being asked, which was how it always went. "You are doing that thing," Mrs. Finch said. "What thing?" "The thing where you look at him like he is the answer to a question you were afraid to ask." Inez wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Is that what I do?" "Every time," Mrs. Finch said, with complete satisfaction. They sat and watched Paul lift Samuel up to sit on the fence rail while the haltered horse stood patiently below them, and Samuel's voice carried across the yard in the high, carrying way of children, asking some question that made Paul tip his head back and laugh. "I asked him once," Inez said quietly, not meaning to say it out loud but saying it anyway. "Early on, before any of this, I asked him why he was being so kind to me when I was a complete stranger. And, Mrs. Finch said, he said I was not a stranger anymore." Mrs. Finch was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like him," she said. "It does," Inez agreed. It was the truest thing about him, she thought. Not the kindness itself, though the kindness was real and deep and had never varied in 8 years, but the specificity of it, the way he did not deal in categories like stranger or not stranger, known or unknown. He met what was in front of him with full attention and an open hand, and once something was in his care, it was in his care completely, and that had never been a strategy or a performance but simply the expression of who he was. She had spent years not trusting kindness because she had experienced kindness as a cover for something else. The fundamental gift of Paul Doyle was that in him it was not a cover for anything. It was the thing itself, all the way down. Paul caught her watching from across the yard and lifted a hand in the easy, unhurried way of someone who is entirely comfortable being seen. She raised her cup back. In the corral, Samuel said something and pointed at his mother on the porch, and Paul looked and nodded. And then Samuel was scrambling down from the fence and running across the yard toward the porch. And behind him, Paul released the horse into the corral and followed at his own pace, and the evening arranged itself around them all with the uncomplicated abundance of something that had been well and carefully made. Samuel arrived on the porch at a breathless run and said, "Papa says, can I have a biscuit before supper?" Mrs. Finch looked at him severely. "Your father said that, did he?" Samuel considered the political landscape quickly. "He said I could ask." "That is considerably more accurate," Mrs. Finch said, and went inside to get him a biscuit, because she always did. Paul came up the porch steps and settled into the chair beside Inez with the slow, satisfied ease of a man at the end of a good day, and she moved the coffee cup so he could sit fully, and he leaned over and pressed his lips briefly to her temple without ceremony or announcement, the particular gesture of 8 years of daily closeness. "How is he with the horse?" she asked. "Natural," Paul said. "He has good hands, patient. He gets the patience from you. He gets the determination from you," Paul said. "Which is the more important quality?" She looked at him sideways. He was watching the corral with that settled, present quality, his gray eyes quiet in the evening light, and she thought, as she had thought many times, that she would like to preserve this exact moment, this exact ordinary evening, not because anything extraordinary was happening in it, but because this was what she had wanted for so long without being able to name it, this quality of being here, of being in a life that was wholly her own, with a person who had seen her clearly from the beginning and had chosen to keep looking. She put her hand over his on the arm of the chair. He turned it over and held hers. From inside the house came the sound of Mrs. Finch and Samuel engaged in their customary negotiation over the number of biscuits that constituted an appropriate pre-supper portion, and from the kitchen garden, the smell of the evening's dinner coming through the open window, and from the corrals, the sound of horses settling for the night. Clara was somewhere in the back of the house with her dolls and her opinions. Augusto was probably in the barn watching Teodoro do something mechanical. The evening light was stretched long and warm across the yard, and the shadows of the fence posts lay in parallel lines across the dust, and the sky overhead was going from blue to gold, to the first faint suggestion of the deep violet that came before dark. This was the life she had arrived at. This was the country on the other side of the hard years. Inez Aldridge Doyle sat on the porch of the ranch that had become her home, with her husband's hand warm in hers, and the sounds of their children and their household filling the evening air around them. And she felt, in the deep and certain way of someone who has finally stopped running, exactly where she was. She was home. She was not a stranger anywhere anymore. In the years that followed, the ranch continued to grow, and the family with it, and the children grew into people who carried in them the combined qualities of their parents in various and interesting configurations. Samuel became, as Teodoro had predicted, an exceptional horseman with an instinct for animals that made him a natural at the business of the ranch. Clara grew into a young woman of formidable intelligence who read everything she could find, and who by the time she was 12 was already conducting correspondence with a girls' school in Santa Fe that her mother had helped establish. Augusto, quiet and thoughtful, developed a talent for the practical engineering of the ranch, the water systems and the structures and the mechanical workings of the windmills and pumps, and by the time he was a teenager was modifying and improving things with a creativity that made Paul say, with considerable pride, that the boy should go east and study engineering properly. Mrs. Finch lived to be 83 years old and died in the spring of 1896, in her bed at the ranch, with the family around her, and the grief of it was real and lasted as grief does. But it was also grief of the only kind, the kind that comes from having genuinely loved someone and been genuinely loved back, and that made it bearable. Teodoro and Alejandro remained with the ranch through all those years, and the recovered family land in the valley was eventually reunited with the larger Cisneros operation, and the partnership that had begun in necessity deepened over the decades into something that was not easily named by the vocabulary of the time, but was recognized by everyone involved as a genuine and valued thing. Paul's shoulder, broken in 1884, troubled him on cold mornings forever after, and Inez learned to read the weather by the way he held himself in the early morning. And on those cold mornings, she made sure the coffee was hot and said nothing about it directly. And he said nothing about it directly, and both of them understood perfectly well what was happening, which was the language of two people who have learned to care for each other without making the caring into a burden. They grew older together in the way of people who have decided that they will face whatever comes as a unit, and who mean it at every level. They disagreed and agreed and made decisions and changed their minds and kept their promises and repaired what broke and built what was needed, and all of it together, in the way that a life that is genuinely shared is lived. And on the evenings when the children were grown and the ranch was quieter, and they sat on the porch together in the long light, Paul and Inez Doyle watched the territory they had helped to shape, the land that was beautiful and difficult and endlessly capable of surprising you, and they held hands the way they always had, and neither of them said anything about the past because the past had arrived exactly here, and here was exactly right. The sky over New Mexico in the evening is something particular. It goes through colors that do not have adequate names in English or in Spanish either, and it does it slowly enough that you can watch the whole transformation if you sit still and pay attention. Paul and Inez had watched it thousands of times from the porch of their ranch, and it had never once been the same twice, and they had never once grown tired of it. That, Inez thought sometimes, watching the sky do its slow and brilliant work, was what love looked like when it was real. Not the same twice, never exhausted, always worth watching. She was not a stranger anywhere. She never had to be again.